Hello, welcome to the third session in the Planet to Plate Festival. 3 days of talks, performances and live events to celebrate the work of the Institute for Sustainable Food at the University of Sheffield. I'm Duncan Cameron, one of the Institute's two co-directors, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Hamish Cunningham, Professor of Computer Science at the University of Sheffield and member of the Institute's executive team. This is a really exciting project, Fishy Business, that Hamish is going to introduce today. And he's going to take us on a virtual walkthrough of Sheffield's new aquaponics mini farm, based with our partners Regather in the Club Garden Road development. And he's developed this piece of work with financial support from our campaign's alumni relations team at the University of Sheffield. He'll also be talking about the wider potential of urban farming to contribute to a more resilient food system in Sheffield and hopefully beyond. After the talk, there will be time for a Q&A, so please post your questions using the little box, the live chat, or you can post it on Twitter using the hashtag #Planet2Plate. And we must also thank our long-term collaborator and videographer, Ed Cartledge, for producing this really excellent video that you're about to see that should introduce you to the new aquaponics mini farm. So I think we will play the video now.
Hello, I'm Hamish Cunningham. I'm from the Institute of Sustainable Food at the University of Sheffield. I'm really happy to be stood here with
me, Gareth Roberts, co-founder of Regather, partnership coordinator at Chef Food and collaborator with Hamish on the mini farm.
The mini farm. The mini farm's an urban farm right slap bang in the middle of Sheffield centre. I can see the town end of London Road down there. I can see Moorfoot over there. We're in the Lansdowne estate, one of Sheffield's big estates. And here's Regather just behind me. And we're actually stood in a garden called Club Garden. And I think Gareth can probably tell us why it's called Club Garden.
Thanks, Hamish. I can indeed.
I thought you could.
Here we are in the Club Garden, which is behind Regather and at the end of Club Garden Road. And the name Club Garden comes through history. So pre-industrial Sheffield, this was fields. This was the agricultural hamlet of Little Sheffield. The moor was a moor, a large open space with not much going on. And we've got then here in the Club Garden, fields and an agricultural economy. Subsistence food growing and workers, agricultural workers, working the land and obviously supplying food to Sheffield, which was the town over by the castle.
Should we have a little aside about the Little Sheffield Feast? Because actually I remember 5 years ago, on the other side of this building, we had a little festival with actually music and people, which we were hoping to do today, but couldn't. And we had a model about this size, and we said we're going to spread urban farming across Sheffield city centre, and hopefully today we're going to see a bit of that.
Yeah.
But Little Sheffield and the Club Garden,
yeah.
It was an agricultural hub, wasn't it, a long time ago?
Yeah, and the Little Sheffield Feast, which, as Hamish said, you've talked about us doing it again. So that was a contemporary reimagining of a traditional event that went on every year seasonally for hundreds of years around about the Michaelmas estate. And it was typically a kind of labour hiring fair, and through some local history research, which is how we found out all about the Club Garden and Little Sheffield, we found poems all about the Little Sheffield town feasts. And one of the main features, obviously you have an event, very large numbers of people in one area, you've got to feed them. So the arrangement apparently was that people from outside the city would bring food in and then they'd swap it for beer. And there began a long-standing tradition that is fair to say has continued to this day. So that was sort of pre-industrial Little Sheffield. Industrial Little Sheffield, characterised really by obviously the rapid industrialisation of the city's economy and its production base, and buildings such as ours, which we can see the back of, works buildings. So this was Hornhandle Works. But at the time, obviously, the club garden became the name of the road, okay? Because the club gardens were allotments, basically. So in that transition from pre-industrial to industrial Sheffield, there were a huge number of allotments here at the club gardens, and the name stuck. And then post-industrial Sheffield, we're going full circle, and it's all about feeding the city on our doorstep using the means available to us. And and that's really the main reason why Regather and the Regather team are so passionate about the mini farm and exploring all the different options available to urban agriculture and urban food production. And that's why we're involved, I guess.
Fantastic, and it's absolutely the best place to have this in the city, to start off what we hope is a programme of spreading urban food production around the place. So what we've done over the last year and a half or so, yeah, I have to be careful with the timescales because
2020 was a bit of a blip, wasn't
2020 sort of disappeared in a haze. I mean, talking about the city centre, Sheffield, I've lived here best part of 30 years now, and Sheffield feels a little bit different, as I suppose everywhere does, to how it felt a year and a half ago. And we're a tremendously lucky place to live. We've got the Peak District on our western side. It's a lovely, friendly place that, at least when I first came here, people called the village. But there's a tremendous amount of suffering and poverty and hardship in Sheffield as well, as there is, across the country. If we take the use of food banks as an indicator for our national health, we're not doing terribly well. A decade of austerity has led to a huge demand for the most basic prerequisites for our existence, food. So we and a lot of other people are thinking harder and harder about how we can try and improve that situation. And we're talking today about the specific contribution that urban food can make, urban food production and growing food in the little unused spaces of cities. The big picture about agriculture is quite often about huge corporations that level massive fields across the Midwest or wherever. They use pesticides, they kill off all the wildlife, and it's all a bit of a nightmare. The soils get degraded by the use of, so we have to use fertilizers. Fertilizers are running out, yada, yada, yada. So what do? Well, it turns out there's actually quite a lot of places in cities like Sheffield where you can put in some additional food production. And we have techniques that are coming out of the laboratory and into practice now that can do that in a very sustainable fashion. And that's what the urban mini farm here is all about. And in a minute, what we're going to do is pop inside. You can see it behind us. We're just about finished. Gareth spent a happy month, well, it was probably a happy month, with a digger pushing aggregate from one side of that platform to another and back again. This is all underneath. This is all old, what was it? It was old housing, right?
Yeah, this is back-to-back housing and workshops that were demolished in the early sort of 1900s or thereabouts, and maybe a little bit later than that. But yeah, it looks like it's a lovely urban green space, and there are very few of them in this area particularly. And Regather's since about 2010, when we first moved into the building, we've done various planting schemes and improvements, whether that's the edible hedgerows just to the side of us here, or the fruit trees that are around us. The little patch of wheat which is growing as part of the Sheffield wheat experiment just over to my left, which is standing nearly 4-5 foot tall now, and we're looking forward to harvesting that later in the year. So we're in an edible landscape, and for us at Regather, that's about being part of a more productive landscape for the city. And obviously food production is a really important part of making the landscape more productive. We're involved in regular community gardening sessions every Sunday here at the club garden. So members of the local community, particularly from the Lansdowne estate, joining us in creating raised beds and planting a whole range of edible foodstuffs. And as that food is ready to harvest, we're going to be cooking and eating as well as growing, and that will take us all the way through to September, all going well for the Little Sheffield Feast, which will see a return after a break, all going well, to a big street food feast, music and merriment. But yeah, with the mini farm playing a key role in producing foodstuffs for that. So yeah, a very exciting time, Hamish, to be introducing this as a new part to the Regather project.
And massively lucky to have a little bit of green space where we can grow vegetables, where the gardening team from the estate can grow vegetables. But obviously a lot of the places that we do have available in cities don't have that luxury. They don't really have soil available.
Yeah.
And indeed, if you go down underneath this soil, then there's quite a lot of old crap and rubble and so on from its past.
Not one for carrots.
Not great for carrots.
No,
true.
Just root,
yes.
root vegetables in general.
Not great for carrots. But what we do have is a technology for growing without soil. And we've built a few of these in Sheffield. I think this is our 4th system now, to try and demonstrate how you can grow food intensively, how you can grow food all year round without access to soil. And we're using a technology called aquaponics to do that. We'll go inside and we'll have a look at an aquaponic system, which is just about complete now. But first I'll describe the concept behind the actual physical structure. We can't see it very well now. It's a bit overgrown at the front. We've still got the Heras fencing in and so on, but that's going to come off fairly soon. Maybe you can see a little better on this model. What we've got basically is a couple of shipping containers. So we've got a couple of shipping containers back to back like this. They provide a secure space, a sheltered space where we can control the environment for the fish that we grow, and where we can make sure that they don't get interfered with or anything of that sort. So the shipping containers are easy things to pick up relatively cheaply in an urban environment. I must say a huge thank you to Mark Parsons and the team at Studio Polpo, Sheffield's sustainable community architect, who did the design for us and indeed built this model. And it's really intended as something that you can drop into all sorts of different city environments and start growing food. So we use shipping containers, quite easy, quite cheap to get started, to provide a structure. And then we've got structures on the outside that Gareth built with the Regather team, which again was a huge amount of fun for him. He really appreciates the opportunity that we gave him to do that, I'm sure. And that's basically Perspex sheets over a wooden frame.
It was quite a stroke of luck, as well as deft skill with the whole team, really, because this site at the beginning of lockdown didn't have shipping containers or a mini farm on it. It actually had some marquees on that allowed us to create the capacity for packing our boxes to meet the level of demand, because we actually doubled our number of customers at Regather in less than a week, and we still managed to serve those customers. And that was thanks to a bit of green space, some marquees, and some awesome teamwork from the Regather team and all of our suppliers as well. So once we'd managed to dismantle the marquee, because we'd sorted out inside the building and decommissioned the event space, took the stage down, built a 250 kilo goods lift, installed refrigerators, etc., that meant that we could move the spare capacity that we created outside back in the building, which then freed up the site for building the mini farm. Then there was the process of planning permission, all the application paperwork. Again, Mark Parsons and the Studio Polpo team couldn't have done it without them. The design work, structural engineers, grounds work inspections, and then dealing with the small matter of the hill. because that wasn't a flat surface. That was a little mound of post-industrial waste. Lots of bricks, huge lumps of concrete and bits of metal and goodness knows what else, all buried in the heap from the clearance of the structures that were on here. But yeah, through some quick learning, a 3-ton digger was involved, and a lot of sweat and tears. But we managed to reuse every single thing that came out of the ground back into the construction of the pad that the mini farm sits on. So lovely gabion cages with lots of house bricks are clearly viewable from other sides of the project. And yeah, and then working with Paget's, who helped us massively with lots of carrying and lifting of aggregates. And yeah, once that was all ready, we got the shipping containers in. That was fun as well. Some cranes and a few kind of like sharp intakes of breath when you're wondering whether it's all going to be level or not.
And they still are level. They haven't moved. They haven't moved an inch in all that time. So
yeah,
you know,
well,
congratulations to the groundwork team.
Oh, that was me.
That was you.
Ah, thanks.
Yeah. What else to say? Okay, so 2 perspex growing chambers, one with some verticals in. They're not in place at the moment. This one we'll go and have a look at just in a few minutes. And this has a bunch of grow beds that use a conventional soil-free growing substrate. We're hoping a bit later on, this kind of green furry stuff over here is hopefully later on the foam substrate growing system that is being presented by Tony Ryan and colleagues at another event in this festival. So you'll hear a bit about that as well. Okay, I think we've probably covered the first part of our menu, and soon we're going to walk inside. So we'll probably cut at this point, I think. Cut.
You can't say to the audience, I think we'll cut at this point.
That finishes the first part of our menu, and in a minute we'll walk inside and have a look at the technical stuff that we've just been talking about.
Hi Jill. Key question of urban agriculture is, can it grow enough food to feed a city?
It's a really good question, and actually the research that we've done at the University of Sheffield has really started to demonstrate the potential of urban horticulture, so growing fruit and veg within our city. So we've looked within Sheffield at the potential to grow fruit and veg for the population, and we used a sort of modelling approach, so looked at the available land that we could potentially grow food in. And when we start to scale that up, coupled to yields that we know people growing food across the UK get for typical staple fruit and veg crops, so things like potatoes, onions, apples, carrots, we project that actually within the city of Sheffield we could feed more than the population on their 5-a-day diet.
If we can grow enough food, if the land's available, what are the other limiting factors that we have to contend with in a city?
So I think when we say the land's available, the first step is, we understood how much green there is that could be used for growing food. But we don't know the ownership of that land necessarily. So for example, gardens are something, as I've mentioned, that we can shift to growing food. People can make that change themselves if they decide they want to, if they have a garden, if they're fortunate enough to have a garden. But the distribution of land across the city isn't equal. So not everyone has a garden that they can grow food in. So then we have systems like allotments. And we know during the COVID pandemic that allotment waiting lists have absolutely skyrocketed in response to people thinking and wanting to grow food. But there aren't enough allotments to go round. So things like growing in community gardens and exploring possibilities for things like micro farms are a really important part of what could be a future urban horticultural system. But there's a big challenge with that, because although we know that people want to grow food on allotments, we don't know whether they want to grow food in these other systems. And what we need to know is what would motivate them to grow food, what they perceive to be barriers to growing food, and how we engage them with it. 80% of the UK population live in cities and towns, and that really means that people are very detached from food production. They're detached from the soil, they're detached from where their food comes from, and that part of the really important important and positive step with growing food in our cities and towns is really linking and making that connection back again in the future.
Wow.
Aquaponics, Gareth. You're one of the world's leading experts.
No, I'm not. You're going to have to tell me all about it.
Okay, I'll tell you about aquaponics. When we want to grow food in unusual places, places specifically that don't have good soils, then the kind of standard way of doing that now is hydroponics. And hydroponics is growing vegetables in water. It's a fantastic technique, it's very mature, very productive, and if you go and get your lettuce from Tesco's or your tomatoes from the co-op, then it's quite likely they've been grown hydroponically. There's a downside, and the downside really is the fertilizers. In order to grow hydroponically, we have to put fertilizers into water, dissolve them. We have to put the plants into a gross substrate like this. These are expanded clay balls. And we have to supply all those nutrients that the plants want through the fertilizers. And we also have to clean the water somehow when we get build-ups of certain chemicals and so on. Fertilizers come either from natural substances that we dig out of the ground, like potash. We've dug a lot of it up already, it's kind of running out. Or it comes from nitrogen fixation processes. And these are incredibly energy intensive processes. I believe it's something like 2% of the world's energy budget is currently devoted to that, to processes like the Haber-Bosch process, nitrogen fixation process, which creates the fertilizers which we can then use in things like hydroponics. So luckily there's a natural alternative to fertilizers, and we've got an example of them just down here. And what we have down here is a big fish tank, and the technology that we're putting into the Club Garden mini farm here at Regather is all about combining aquaculture with the hydroponics that I've just been talking about to make a different system called aquaponics. One of the most sustainable and low impact forms of agriculture that we have, because what we do instead of having fertilizers is that we just feed the fish. We host, in this case, some goldfish, actually koi carp, in our system. We feed them, they metabolize the fish food, and they produce ammonia. In those beds over there, which I'll talk about a bit more in a minute, we encourage the cultures of nitrifying bacteria. They then translate the ammonia into nitrites and then to nitrates. And nitrates is plant food. So the plants that we have growing in those beds suck the nitrates out of the water. They clean the water, which comes back to the fish, and they get their nutrients from it. So the plants grow quickly, and the fish get clean water, and we have this kind of virtuous circle. Incredibly low impact, low environmental impact, and very efficient. So what's the catch? Well, the problem with aquaponics is complexity, and that's the main reason we believe why aquaponics hasn't spread as widely and as rapidly as hydroponics has. In aquaponics, we have to worry about 3 different organisms in a symbiotic ecosystem. So we've got the fish, we've got the plants. We haven't grown these in here. This basically didn't exist before this morning. This is from my allotment. Thanks, Anna. And we've got bacteria. The point behind this growing media is that it has a very large surface area. And on that surface area, all the little wiggly bits, all the little holes, we cultivate these bacteria. Well, actually, they cultivate themselves. You don't really have to do much. They just turn up and happily start metabolizing and changing the ammonia into nitrates. We have to keep them happy. We have to keep the plants happy. We have to keep the fish happy. I mean, this is a good thing for lots of reasons. It means that we can't use pesticides on the plants. The fish aren't going to like the pesticides. It means we can't use growth hormones for the fish. That's going to interfere with the plant metabolisms. And it means that we can't flush the water away in the way that hydroponic systems often flush flush water when they need to clean out. Because if we flush the water, we lose half our bacterial population. So it's good that we have this ecosystem, this symbiotic ecosystem, because it means that we end up with an incredibly clean growing process. It's basically an organic growing process, although in the UK the Organic Certification Authority is the Soil Association, and understandably they're not that interested in growing things in stuff that isn't soil. But yes, we have this lovely, clean, organic growing system, but it's complex. We have to keep all those things happy. So what can we do about that? And that's really the core of the research that we've been doing at the University of Sheffield now for a few years. And what we're trying to do is to use a little bit of automation and a little bit of knowledge sharing to address that problem of complexity. And we hope that as we do that, as we get that stuff to work in practical contexts like this, we can really show people how they can do it themselves. We can lead growers to a situation where they can use stuff like this just as easily as they use hydroponics. So we're using technology in two ways to try and help with this complexity problem. The first way is we automate as much as we can in the aquaponics system, using tiny little microcomputers, microcontrollers like this one. And this allows us to control things like water flow in the system. It allows us to keep track of the things like acidity, pH in the water, temperature. It allows us to track how much light is coming in, and when we correlate that with things like how fast our tomatoes grow, we start getting a sense of what are the best things to grow in particular climatic conditions and so on. And all of this gets pushed into the cloud. It gets pushed out over the internet into databases running in data centers. And then that allows us to do the second thing, which is to support and to share knowledge between growers. So we have dashboards that will give you a view of what your system is doing today, and it'll also give you time series data about how your system and other systems like it have performed over time. So when you come in and test the water or look at the water levels on a Monday morning and they're going in a direction that you don't expect, it's relatively easy for you then, instead of having to pull out a big chemistry textbook and pour through it all and try and figure out what's going on, you go to your dashboard and you find similar examples from elsewhere, and you find means for dealing with that problem, and the little traces of carbonates or whatever, or eggshells or this, that, and the other that you might add to the system to properly buffer it. So we're hoping that when we have these systems that are coming from our laboratories, when we have them properly working in a practical setting, somewhere like Regather, in the middle of the city centre, somewhere that's easy for people to come and have a look around, then we can really make a massive step forwards in the adoption of this kind of sustainable food growing technology, and we can see more urban food getting grown across Sheffield and other cities. And that's basically the point. So Gareth, I'm about finished. I do need to say a couple of massive thank yous.
Indeed.
Well, first to Regather, but also to the Institute for Sustainable Food, who fronted the bill, to Gareth Coleman of BitFixit and Growbotics, and to Pi Moroni, our helpers with the electronics. Thanks, folks.
I'd like to say a massive thanks to Hamish for making the project possible, and all the team at the Institute of Sustainable Food, because in a global pandemic, the last thing you expect to be doing is growing fish and plants in a mini farm behind your community business. So massive thanks to you guys. Also really big thanks to Bryn, to all the team at Studio Polpo, Mark Parsons, various professional services that have had a role in making the project possible, to the council for granting the planning permission on the back of our use of the club garden space for over a decade. Really great to have those trusted relationships to do amazing projects. Thanks to Paget's, Thanks to the digger hire companies who pulled out all the stops to make sure I didn't kill myself in the 3-ton digger. And thanks to the Regather team for putting up with all of this disruption all the way through lockdown and making it work at the same time.
And thanks to Ed Cartledge from Sort of Films for getting here on very short notice. And I think we've got time for questions.
Brilliant. What a fantastic video, and really showing these excellent technologies and how we can produce food sustainably, but also in partnership with organisations like Regather. Really amazing stuff, Hamish. And unsurprisingly, the questions are flooding in. There's still time to post questions. If you want to post a question in the chat, please do, or using hashtag Planet to Plate on Twitter. So I guess the first question is one that we've discussed at length over the last few years working together on aquaponics, and that is that we kind of tend to think of aquaponics as a technology for, you know, high-end restaurants making electric daisies or stuff like that to put on fancy cocktails, but I guess the question is, can it really be scaled up? And maybe you want to talk a little bit about the work that Ava Pensacola did for us, looking at the scalability of this kind of technology.
Scalability is, yeah, interesting question. And as is the whole issue of resource and how much resource it takes to get one of these systems going. And when it comes up in conversation, I always point people to a fantastic book that was produced by the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization. A chap called Somerville was the lead author on it. But they did a huge amount of work looking at how these systems could be built using commonly available materials that people can find in all sorts of differently resourced economies, looking at how the costs of startup can be amortized across a couple of growing seasons, and really trying to quantify you know, what the costs and benefits to small growers was. And their conclusion really was that this kind of technology was appropriate for all sorts of different levels of resource. And we've tried to continue in that vein to some degree. We were lucky enough to be able to support a system in Nepal that was originally worked on by Charlie Price of UK aquaponics fame, and was a precursor to some of the work in the Institute that we're doing now. So I think from the point of view of low resource economies and small growers, it's fairly clear that we can do it in a you know, in a way that isn't too costly. And that sort of points to the potential, at least, to scale it up and to grow a lot of food without it being prohibitively expensive. And I agree that what has happened in several instances in the UK and elsewhere is that new technologies like this have gained a first foothold in kind of very niche kind of contexts, and, you know, doing samphire for restaurants, or having tea that you can mint for tea that you can snap off at the counter in the cafe. And we obviously want to see these things become bigger. The problem with scaling is, I think, really in relation to the difficulties of introducing new food system technologies into the existing markets. And the existing markets obviously are fairly dominated by the big players and so on. And as I alluded to in the film earlier on, it's fundamentally, you know, if you regard profit as the only real driver of innovation in a market, which the big players often do for fairly structural reasons, then it's hard to make that leap, because the big driver for aquaponics is sustainability, and we see over and over again, don't we, that We know how to do things in a sustainable fashion. You know, people have invented all sorts of methods. Scientists, social scientists have shown how they can be applied and so on, and they don't happen to the degree that we need. And that's really a kind of structural, systemic problem in the market. So why I'm excited about urban food in particular is because we're somewhat stepping outside of this massive, great corporate-dominated system and facilitating people to do it, albeit to begin with on a small scale, outside, you know, in community groups, around food hubs like Regather and so on and so forth. So that excites me about urban food. The work that you referred to from Peter's colleague Ava a year or two back, I think that looked at some examples from places. The one that sticks in my mind was Cleveland.
Yeah.
And in Cleveland, they developed this fantastic model where the big institutions in what was actually quite a depressed locality, institutions like universities and hospitals that survive even in the bad times, they became these they call them anchor institutions, and they were able to use some of their power as a big buyer to stimulate innovation in the food system. And you know what I'm really hoping that we're going to have a chance of doing much better now that we have the institute, you know, now that we're kind of plugged into university power structures and so on in Sheffield, is that maybe we can start thinking about becoming one of those anchor institutions, and that we can contribute to the work of people like Regather, Beanies, Sheffield Organic Growers. All these people are doing great stuff, and community groups around the city.
And I guess this kind of technology is really well placed when we're thinking about the values-based food system that is evolving in cities. Certainly that's starting to evolve in Sheffield. Chef Food and Regather have been a real kind of nexus for that way of thinking about the food system. So I guess just very briefly, could you kind of outline the kind of things that we could realistically grow using the technology that you showed us?
It's not great for carrots, unfortunately.
It's not great for carrots.
And carrots aren't great for Regather's little soil bit, but pretty much anything apart. You can grow root vegetables using aquaponics. You have to jump through some hoops to do it. But pretty much anything apart from root vegetables. So I've grown cucumbers, lots of leafy greens, tomatoes, strawberries, and I'm about as green-fingered as the average computer scientist. So it's definitely not rocket science. One of the things that people very typically grow in aquaponics is leafy greens of one sort or another, salad greens. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that we often import those types of vegetables. A lot of that kind of vegetable in England comes from Spain, in the UK comes from Spain. And what we're doing when we import like that is we're transporting 90% water. Yeah. You know, leafy greens are basically water with a bit of green in them. I'm not a plant scientist, as you may have noticed. So, that's a fantastically inefficient way of shifting nutrition around the world. That's one reason. Other reason is, that's something that's quite often lacking from our diets. Yeah. And as Jill alluded to in the middle segment in the film, and a lot of her work has pointed up, what we eat is often a matter of what's available to us within our means. We can't blame people for what they eat, because this was something that you and Peter covered this morning as well, because it's to do with the whole range of factors apart from what's good for us. Sure. And what we should eat. So, leafy greens and salad, but basically everything apart from carrots.
So that's great. Thanks, Hamish. There's a lot of questions that are kind of focusing on what the fish are fed with and whether or not the fish feed itself is sustainable. So maybe you could tell us a bit more about that.
Sure. So the thing about fish food, we're really contrasting the fish food with the fertilizers. There's kind of an equivalence there as far as inputs to hydroponics and aquaponics. And the good news about the fish food is that it's potentially sustainable. The bad news is that it's not necessarily sustainable. Yeah. And indeed, a lot of fish food now is produced in pretty horrible ways and not sustainably. So looking at the good news and the potential for the future, and this is again something that as that our colleagues have worked on. Indeed, in this building, there was an interesting research project just a couple of years ago. The good news is that fish are very flexible with regard to where they get their nutritional inputs from. The project that I was referring to here was with insects. So we were growing, and a number of people have grown a thing called black soldier flies. Yeah. They're lovely in various ways. Well, it's hard to, you don't often say that a fly is lovely, but a black soldier fly does all its eating in the larval stage. So when it's actually flying around and buzzing around, it's not trying to land on you and suck up your sweat like a blue bottle. So it's a lot less disturbing as a kind of, as a housemate. Not that you'd want a huge number in your house, but they're not native here, so if they escape, you're not going to get a plague of black soldier flies. But what they do is provide a great protein source, and it's one that you can either feed to the fish directly, or you can send through another organism. Kate Humble's aquaponic farm in Monmouthshire, they feed, I've forgotten exactly the bird, but it's a food bird, and they take waste food. They grow the insects on the waste food, so we're reprocessing the food waste. They put it through this other organism, and then they come up with fish food. So that gets us around the kind of restrictions that are in place after mad cow and so on. Because you're not feeding an organism to itself. You've got enough reprocessing going on that you're confident that things like prions won't get through and so on. But it's a fantastic way of reprocessing food waste and getting close to some kind of circular economic way of producing good food in our cities and so on.
I totally agree, and I think across aquaculture we're seeing waste streams increasingly being incorporated, and obviously there's some I can never say that word, legislative barriers to get over in terms of incorporating waste products into foodstuffs. But Australia, for example, has done that really effectively in terms of developing what they call novel feeds, right? And I think at the moment, the not necessarily sustainable is a potential barrier, but it's a barrier that is by no means insurmountable. So I think you're absolutely spot on that the sustainability will come in time. So we've got quite a few questions also asking about the choice of fish. So made me smile when one of the questions is, why don't you use tilapia? So maybe you want to talk a bit about the fish species that you can grow in aquaponics.
Well, of course, our colleague Jake Nichols was growing tilapia just up the road in our controlled environment centre until relatively recently, and many people do. For those who don't know it, tilapia is a white fish that grows quite rapidly. It's a huge food fish across many areas of the world, Asia and elsewhere. It loves the heat, so it's difficult in this country to get tilapia to grow quickly in the winter and so on. I mean, there's lots of different factors in choosing fish, and the main factor that we have chosen for this system is simplicity. We're running vegetarian systems, so we're not harvesting the fish. There's no reason why we couldn't, but it makes it an awful lot simpler from a regulatory point of view and various other points of view, not actually to harvest the fish. So really what we need for this, these particular types of systems are fish that are going to be happy in our climate, that are going to be robust, that are going to enjoy living in the kinds of conditions that we want them to live in. And then you've got a number of options. Goldfish are a great option. Carp are a good option. We've got a system in Healy City Farm, which is run by Gareth Coleman, my long-term collaborator on this stuff. And they grow carp there. And they do harvest those fish, especially at the time of Polish celebrations, because Polish people love a spot of carp with their posh dinner. Trout, quite a few people try and grow trout. There's a lovely aquaponic installation down near Bristol called Bio Aqua Farm. And they have some big trout pools there, and they do harvest them. They they do one of these niche things that we were talking earlier about. They make trout pate. They'll sell trout in a bun at a festival and things like that. So they're selling the food at slightly above the typical market price for our country for this sort of thing. So that was all a bit incoherent, but the basic message is that you have lots of choices according to what sort of fish you want to grow and whether you want to harvest them or just run a vegetarian system.
Great, thank you. And you've just kind of raised the issue of cost and market price there. A lot of people are putting questions in the chat that want to understand how much it would cost them to set up an aquaponics farm. So maybe you could tell us how much that aquaponics farm was, and is it scalable to have a micro version, for example, in your own greenhouse at home?
I have had a version in my greenhouse. One of the things we've been trying to do is so every bloody greenhouse in the UK, is the same size. It's 6 or 8 foot wide and a multiple of 2 long. And that study by the UN that I referred to earlier on used a thing called an IBC, a bulk container, which you'll have seen around on farms. Building sites now sometimes use them. Outside Peter's office, there's about 100 of them sitting full of water to provide ballast to a big crane for the building site and so on. They're extremely cheap and easy to get all over the place. And you just chop, you take 3 containers, you use 1 for your fish tank, you chop up a couple more for your grow beds and you have a sump. And that's a couple of £100 worth of kit. You then need a water pump. You can use a standard pond pump and a standard pond air pump. That's maybe another couple of £100. And then you've got a bit of plumbing to connect it all together. Really, the housing for it, where you're going to put it, is sometimes the biggest problem in our climate because you can't leave it out in the rain. In Australia they do it and you don't worry too much about the rain. But if you get a lot of rain directly into your aquaponics tank, then you're starting to dilute the water. It's going to interfere with the bacterial populations. Things are going to go out of balance. So you want to put it in a greenhouse, which means, in my case, privileged university guy that I am, I bought a special greenhouse which was a bit wider and a bit longer than the normal, and I could just fit it into my back garden. We would like and started moving towards building systems that would fit into the standard-sized greenhouse. And the guy who really pushed this along is a guy called Dave Hartley, runs a little company in Attercliffe, in Sheffield, in Atlas rather, called Shokoi. And he has this brilliant way of making flexible tanks out of flexible plastic liners that basically sit inside scaffolding poles, like a big bag. Those are the ones we've got at Regather now. And unfortunately, he doesn't have a retail product available at the moment, so I can't quote you a price for that. And the pandemic's been a hard time for small organisations like his, and we're a bit stuck with that at the moment. But if you've got enough space, then for a fair bit less than £1,000, you can pick up all the technology and get going. It really depends how DIY friendly you are yourself. So.
And to scale this up to a semi-commercial scale, I mean, how much did we spend? I can't remember at Regather.
So the total bill for the entire thing is running around the 40k mark at the moment. So
we're not talking huge sums of money. It's feasible to do this in your greenhouse.
Touchwood, yeah, touchwood. And when you're thinking about community groups, of which luckily we have quite a lot in Sheffield. Sheffield's so lucky to be the city in the UK with the biggest concentration of allotments anywhere. We've got massive numbers of allotments, massive numbers of people who are interested in growing, good community groups. Hopefully you can think realistically about people starting to do this in their own little patches.
And I guess then to follow that up with another question that's come in, which is dealing with complexity. So do you really need special expertise if you're going to set up an aquaponics farm? Because it does sound quite technical.
I think you need to be an enthusiast if you're going to do it without help. So you need to read a couple of books and you need to be in there every day, at least in the first few months, checking on the fish health, checking on the water quality and acidity and so on. So yes, you need a fair amount of enthusiasm and a bit of drive to do it, and a bit of time. That's kind of my little part of the picture, which really is quite a little part, but it's about the computing technology that can help.
Yeah.
And that's, basically what we're hoping to do as part of the research program that I'm involved with, is to make it easier.
Sure.
So you don't have to be quite such an enthusiast.
And we've had a couple of questions about the substrate, and I know you talked a bit about Tony and my foam project, but particularly around the energy and recyclability of the substrate. So does it take a huge amount of energy to make your expanded clay balls?
Anecdotally, I've heard that it is quite high energy to make
Yeah.
those. Yeah. There are an awful lot of them produced, and unfortunately you will find quite a few of them by the side of the road having been fly tipped. And I think that's because there's quite a large number of people growing some puff in the basement, growing some cannabis, and they do it using hydroponics generally, and they use these clay balls. When they get to the end of their cycle, they just throw the stuff out, so that's why you get it fly tipped around and about. In aquaponics, at least, it's a little bit of a better situation because we're never wanting to throw anything away, and we don't have to throw anything away until it's really worn out. And I think it's realistic to use those clay ball systems for about a decade. So yes, they're high energy, but if you're careful with them and you're not chucking them over your neighbour's fence, then maybe it's not quite such a bad thing.
Yeah, and I think there are kind of emerging technologies in substrates. It's a really intensive area for research at the moment, including in Sheffield. So the infinitely recyclable polymer foams that you've been involved in testing, that Tony Ryan and his team have been developing, and we'll hear a bit about the inspiration behind those in the Desert Garden talk, I think are really starting to democratise access to the technology, because they make it an awful lot easier and more environmentally sustainable.
And they're also a lot easier to transport, because you just
Absolutely. Absolutely. You're not transporting air.
A little anecdote about clay balls. So you go into a hydroponics shop and you say, I want this and that and so on, and you start walking out with the massive heap of clay balls to build your aquaponics system. And they carefully count out black bin liners, the same number as you've got sacks of clay balls. And you think, hang on a minute, it's in the bag. I've got, I'm limber, I can carry it out. What do I need a black bin liner for? And basically it's to wrap it up so that you can take it home and get it in your house without anybody knowing that you're doing hydroponics in your house, because that would be an indicator of something. I have no idea what.
I can't imagine.
I said, no, I'm legit, it's all right.
This is an interesting question, and I don't know if you anecdotally, or maybe you've measured this, I don't know, something that we can maybe look at in some of our future projects. But do vegetables grown in aquaponics taste differently from vegetables grown in soil? Yeah,
I have no. To be honest, I think I'm incapable of measuring it. I don't really have the scientific background to do that, but I know a man who does. And I mean, anecdotally, people have said both things, and I've had, I suppose, one of the nicest food experiences I've had. Actually, two really lovely food experiences I've had have been visiting established aquaponics farms, Kate Humble's one and BioAquafarm, and wandering around, and the people showing you around, picking a bit of this or that, and you eating it right away, or preparing delicious meals afterwards. And those have been, really special events as far as the flavours and the quality of the food. Totally anecdotal, but yeah.
Well, here's hoping we'll get to try and test that when the Little Sheffield Food Festival returns. After how long?
Oh, I think it was a biennial thing, so I think it's probably 3 years. Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. I'm conscious of time. We've only got a few minutes left, but there are a couple of things to end with. So, one very specific question about whether or not you use anti-algal chemicals in the growth tanks and fish containment tanks.
No, I mean, first principle is to avoid anything like that. You may, if you're forced to, then you might try and identify something that was okay for the three organisms. Algae buildup happens. It's, you use fatter pipes than you would normally use, so you've got a bit of clearance. Every now and again, you might want to take the pipes off and give them a clean, scrub the side of your fish tank. We don't use clear materials, we use opaque materials to reduce the sunlight and so on, but we haven't had a problem with algae.
Okay, and so the last point is really more of a comment, I guess, than a question. The poser of the question says that they were unaware of the technology and that it was so accessible. Hydroponics always seems most at home on board spaceships, in alien films, and the like. So I think they've been quite inspired by what you've had to say. And the reason I pick up on that, and I'm slightly amused by that, is, of course, a lot of the inspiration behind the technologies, these kind of technologies for growing food on Earth, do indeed come from the space program. Yep. The LEDs that we use now to grow our plants were pioneered and developed for the space program. And interestingly, the Institute has just funded a really exciting project by two early career scientists to start to have a look at the role of the kind of technologies that you've developed and that Tony and my team have developed in relation to the space program in the context of the Mars mission. So, it might sound far-fetched, but actually exactly the technologies that we've been talking about and that you've been showcasing today are much more mainstream than one might imagine, and are very much at the foundation of our manned mission to Mars, which I think is really exciting.
And I think it's actually great to think of the planet as that space missions have to have this very controlled ecosystem that's going to survive and be sustainable. Well, we do too. Our planet is a spaceship, and that's how we need to think about it, I think.
And absolutely, and I think as time moves on and resources become more scarce and food becomes more treasured, I think that the kind of technologies that you showcase today and that we'll hear about in Desert Garden will move squarely away from niche and very much into the mainstream.
Let's hope so.
So brilliant. Thank you very much, Hamish, and thanks to Gareth and the Regather team for working with you today, and for the awesome Ed cartilage of Thought Of films of stepping in at the last moment. That was really great. So, and I hope everyone has enjoyed hearing from Hamish and his really exciting work.
Thank you.